Hey everyone, in this video we're going to ask a very simple question with a really complicated answer. Where did Latin come from? Now it sounds kind of silly. Why would we ask this, right? But I like to ask my students this at the beginning of their Latin 1 career, right? Right from the start when we first start learning this language, I ask them, where did it come from? And I have them think about it. Because I think too often we just assume that Latin came from, from Italy and it just sprung out of the ground and everyone was speaking it and it has no connection to the bigger world. Not true. And when you unpack its connection to the bigger world, you start to see these really interesting connections, not only from its past, but where it went afterwards with things like the Romance languages and how it impacts our world today. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to explore that in a pretty quick little video, just so we can understand where Latin came from. So like I said, Latin came from Italy, right? That's what we think of when we think of Latin. Where did people speak it? In Rome, which is in Italy, right? So this is where you want to start. But it goes further back than that. It's not just Italy. So this chart is showing you a bunch of different languages from across the world, and it's comparing the same word in those different languages. Now, someone much smarter than me, right? A lot of linguists much smarter than me, so I take zero credit for this. They realized that when you look at languages like English, for instance, right? And you look at the word is, he, she, or it is, the verb to be. When you start looking at languages around the world, ancient languages, you see connections, right? In Latin, fourth from the bottom, we have est. In Greek, we have esti. In Sanskrit, we have asti. They all look the same, right? And if you go to Anglo-Saxon and Old Irish, it looks the same spelling, right? But then Lithuanian, Russian, how are all these languages connected, right? Look at the word mother or brother or ten. They all look really similar. And what happened is linguists realized these languages are connected. And if they're connected, right, and they're in such different parts of the world, they must have come from one source. And that's really where it gets interesting. This one source that they think it came from is called Indo-European, right? It's this hypothetical sort of early proto-language that we can't see, right? You can't pick up a book and necessarily read this proto-Indo-European, but it exists. You can tell by the languages that it's impacted. You can see where the roots came from and understand how the language must have spread. So Indo-European is pretty cool because if you look at the languages that came from it, you have languages from all over that Mediterranean, European and Asian world with Baltic, Slavic, Albanian, Germanic, Latin, Sanskrit. They're all related to each other, which is really cool and something we want to look at in this video. So if you take a look and follow this animation, you'll start to get a sense of how this happens, right? How does language spread? How do speakers of Indo-European spread? And you can see that we think they started in basically this one place right near the Black Sea. And then people start migrating. That's just how civilizations and peoples work. They don't stay in one place. They go to better climates or where there's food or whatever the case may be. And they're bringing their language with them. Now, when they do that, since they all started from this hypothetical sort of starting point of Indo-European, they're bringing that with them, that language and culture. And over time, as that proto-language or mother language, you might think of it, as it spreads to different parts of the world, it changes and it morphs, but the roots of it stay the same. And that's why we can see such interesting connections between all these languages across the world. And that's the kind of history that Latin is part of. So you want to understand that Latin is one of these languages that comes from this kind of common root. And it helps you see that the world is much more connected than you might have realized, right? If you go back far enough, everyone is speaking kind of the same language, right? And it adapts and morphs over time, which is what makes it really cool. So now we want to think more specifically, what languages are connected to Indo-European? Well, we kind of hit on it, but the ones we want to look at right now, if you happen to be an English speaker, are Germanic and Latin, right? So these two branches off that Indo-European tree are really important for us because from Germanic, we get English, right? That's where that Anglo-Saxon and English come from. It's really a Germanic language. So when we think about Latin and English are not necessarily connected in terms of their roots. But Latin does create 5 languages that you should realize. They're called the Romance languages. You have French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, right? And this is why we always tell people, right? We tell our students as Latin teachers, if you learn Latin and know Latin, it's a lot easier to figure out French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, or Romanian, right? You can kind of pick it up and go because these languages all come from Latin. So one way to think about it is that French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, or Romanian are really just dialects of Latin, right? So if you're thinking of the Romans, when they go to, modern day France, Gaul back in their time, and they're bringing Latin with them, it's going to change and morph. And the way that people speak Latin in France is going to be a little bit different from the way they speak it in Spain, right? Or in Italy. And over time, these morph into, basically different languages, but ones that are really connected, right? You can still see the connections between them, which is why studying Latin is so cool, right? And it can kind of launch you into learning a bunch of different languages. For our purposes here, we want to think about the connection to English, right? You'll see the purple or pink line here. It's connected to French, and this is kind of the secret that I always tell my students. In schools today, French may or may not be a big part of your high school or the world language program. But I can tell you that if you were going to pick one of these Romance languages to learn, Italian, right, is pretty good to come from Latin for sure. But French is also a pretty easy one to figure out. And I can only say that because I took French and I did find it a little bit easier. I can't speak for the other ones. But the reason why it's a little bit easier is because French and English are related to each other. So you might be wondering, how is that possible? Well, here's how. So the Romans, right, invade Britannia in 43 CE of Emperor Claudius, and they show up with Latin. So they're bringing Latin and it's mixing with that local kind of Germanic English, language that was there that the local British people are speaking. And it kind of morphs over time into something a little bit different, right? This beginnings of English. And it's kind of related to, that Germanic Anglo-Saxon too, when that migration happens. The second big date you want to think about is the Norman invasion, right? 1066, William the Conqueror, he shows up. What language does he speak? French, right? French comes from Latin. So you have a history, a long period of British history where the kings are speaking French, which is, again, really Latin. So again, we have this influx of Latin through French going into English. And the last big thing that you want to think about, the big event, is really the Renaissance, right? When that rebirth happens and people start looking backwards at science and language and culture, they look back to Latin and they kind of rediscover it and they start bringing those Latin words into English, particularly through the sciences. So this is why English is really a combination of German, French, and Latin. That's really what it is. But there is a very heavy influx of Latin into English. And this is the reason why, right? This is why, studying Latin, a lot of the words look really familiar to you and derivatives and things like that. It's because of this impact or this influence, rather, of Latin on English. So again, it helps you kind of understand where Latin came from and how it impacts us today. And you can see it on a chart like this, right? And again, this is there's a bunch of charts like this out there. This is just one that I happen to use. But if you look at Latin as the far left column, then you have Italian, French, Spanish, and English, right? You can see the connection. And if you're wondering, for instance, amicus, friend, right? Why does it look so familiar to Italian, French, and Spanish? Well, they're Romance languages, right? They come from Latin, so they held on to that Latin root. Why does English look pretty different? Well, it's because it has that Germanic influence, right? Which is why you get words like friend or book is a pretty good German word, right? That's not connected to Liber. But again, one way to think about it is a professor once told me that, you go to work in Latin and you come home in German is kind of the idea, or English rather, I guess you can kind of think of it that way. So the more common word is book, but think of like the more, I guess, fancy term from where you get books, and it's the library, right? The library is the Latin root. So it's interesting how English works. There really is this mix of Latin and German in it in the words that we say every day. So I would encourage you to, if you want, pause the video here and take a look at just where all these words come from, and you're going to see the connections between the Latin, the Italian, the Spanish, and the French. And this is why I keep saying that if you know Latin and study Latin, I'd highly encourage you to go out and try to learn any of these Romance languages. It'll be a little bit easier for you, right? It doesn't mean you can't learn it without knowing Latin. It just means knowing Latin does give you a little bit of an advantage there because they're all connected to each other. So when you think of language this way, I think the bigger picture is kind of cool too. You don't want to think of languages as being isolated because they're really not. So this is a good illustration that came from The Guardian, and it's showing you those Indo-European roots, right? The tree and the different branches. All these languages are connected to each other. And if you look at the different parts of the tree, it really shows you how the world is a pretty small place, right? It feels big and it feels different, and we're all speaking different languages. But if you go back far enough, they are all coming from the same root, which I think is a really cool cultural connection. It'll hopefully open your mind to other cultures and let you understand that we're part of a bigger world, right? You can't just think of yourself as only speaking English. I would encourage you to go out and try to learn other languages, as many as you can, so you can be part of the bigger world around you. So the next thing I want to show you is a really cool image that I think I found on Twitter. So I'm not going to take any credit for it. So credit to Mr. Belton, if I'm pronouncing that right on the bottom. But I remember seeing this on Twitter once, and it's a great illustration of how language spreads and the way it can spread. So what you're looking at is basically a map of Africa, Europe, and Asia, showing you the word tea, right? And how depending on the way or the method in which tea was traded to you, whether it was by sea or by land, you call it something different, right? So all the blue dots are basically sea travel and maritime trade. And anyone getting the tea from China by boat, it's showing up as the word tea, right? That's how it's called. And you can see it in English, Dutch, Italian is on there. Down in South Africa, you can see it. In Java, you can see it, and even going down into southern India. But if you look at the purple dots, pinkish purple, whatever those are, you can see that if it came from land travel, it's related to the word chai in English, right? It's got that root to it. And you can see all the different parts of the world where they call it basically some version of chai. And I think that's really, really cool because one, it shows you the connection across the world in terms of language, but it also shows you how language spreads, which is what we're talking about here, right? People move, they travel. If you're wondering, how did Latin spread through the world? Or rather through Europe, I guess, and North Africa and Asia, like the Middle East. How did it spread? Well, this is how. People move, people travel, people trade. And when you're doing all these things, you're bringing your language and culture with you. And that spreads across the world in really interesting ways. So I think this is just a cool diagram to show you, how the world is connected and how language can move in different ways. It's really flexible, and just how interesting it is to see, the method by which language can spread. It's a really cool visual. So I'd encourage you to feel free to pause the video or look up this tweet and dive more into it. This is kind of the way I want to end in this short video, the impact of Indo-European on the modern world. So what you're looking at is every country in blue is showing you a place in the world where they speak in Indo-European language, right? So the dark blue, I believe, are your Indo-European languages, and the light blue are basically languages that have roots in it or are related to it. So anywhere that you see blue here has a connection to that Indo-European root. It's almost the entire world, right? I mean, there's big chunks missing, but still, this is a really, really large part of the world. And again, the reason I show this to my students is to kind of illustrate for them that the world is much more connected than you think. And I would highly encourage you to think about language and culture as being connected. You are part of a bigger world, right? Whether you want to be or not. And I would really encourage you to think about how language can unify us and unite us, because there are so many problems in the world. You just look around, turn on the news, you're going to see them. But once you realize that you're part of a bigger picture, right? I think that's a really, really cool unifying factor. We want you to be global citizens. It's kind of a buzzword in education, but we want our students to be that. I think language is one of the best vehicles to show you how connected you are to the world. And learning about Indo-European is a great way to see that. So again, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and it shows you, like I said, that Latin is not an isolated thing. It is part of the bigger world picture, right? And that's why it's so important. And I think it's really, really cool to study. And I enjoy teaching it, and hopefully my students enjoy learning it too. Think about yourself in the bigger picture. It'll show you that you are part of a much larger world, and it'll show you just how big the impact of Latin and the languages it's connected to, the impact, how big it has been on the world, right? Back in ancient times and today. So I'd encourage you to look more into this, have fun with it, and just, it's something to think about.